So for our program today, we'll be talking with In and Out Spatial Influences on Identity Creation artist, Birdie Brachbill. Birdie is currently in their 4th year with a prospective graduation date of May 2023. They are pursuing their BFA in studio art with a visual and critical studies thesis. Their artistic practice primarily focuses on sculpture, which we'll learn more about in their talk today. In and Out Spatial Influences on Identity Creation is on view in Sight Sharp Gallery until Wednesday, February 23rd. It's currently up. It opened yesterday. And Sight Galleries is open to current SAIC students, faculty, and staff, and open to the public by appointment. You can find more information about visiting the gallery on our website. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Birdie. One quick last housekeeping kind of note is that throughout the program, we invite attendees to use the chat box to share your thoughts and reactions, but please make sure your microphone is muted throughout the talk today. In our last 10 to 15 minutes of the program, we'll open it up for questions. And at that point, you can either ask your questions in the chat box and I will ask them out loud to Birdie, or you can just turn your camera on and turn your microphone on and talk with us directly. So without further ado, Birdie, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna pull up my screen. I have to warn you, my cat might make noises. She has been very vocal today and she just woke up from a nap. So we'll see how that goes. Let me do this. Okay, can you all see that without my notes? Okay, perfect. All right, so my name is Birdie Brachbill. I use they, them pronouns. I was born in Shelbyville, Illinois, in Central Illinois, 1999. And I graduated high school in 2018, and up until about junior year of high school, I wanted to be a doctor and decided very quickly to come to art school. I liked making art, and I don't know, I was not into the whole doctor path at the time, and I think it's been the best sporadic decision I've ever made. Like Maren said, I am getting a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Studio Art with a Visual and Critical Studies thesis. My practice primarily is focused in sculpture, critical writing, and theory, and new media. I have a lot of influences that influence my practice. That is a long list, such as Doris Salcedo, queer theory, Maggie Nelson, Gregor Schneider, language, Gordon Hall. Gordon Hall is actually an SAIC alum in 2011. They graduated with an MA and an MFA in Visual and Critical Studies. Rachel White-Reed, Domestic Spaces, and Adrian Piper, who's a Kant theorist. I actually have to owe this whole thing to Rachel White-Reed, who doesn't even know who I am, but I was listening to a podcast the day that this proposal was due. And I had the idea of postponing turning in the proposal. I felt I was scared, essentially. And I was at work and listening to a podcast before the store opened, and I was listening to Rachel White-Reed speak, and I was like, Rachel White-Reed would be so upset with me if I postponed this. So I told my employer I had a migraine and went home and finished this proposal, and now here we are. So I have this all to owe to her. I don't think did it change no, there we go. So a little bit about my practice. So my practice has been centered around identity for a few years. My practice informs my identity informs my practice. They have a very tight bond, and there is no divorce in sight. Freshman year, I came to SAIC. I had been experimenting with a drag persona. I was making work and proposing work freshman year that had a lot to do with death and the killing of an identity, specifically this drag persona that was named Birdie. And I had a professor that asked, like, why do you want to kill off Birdie? And I quickly realized I didn't at all want to do that. And that there was a part of me, a part of my cisness that I identified at the time that I did not agree with. I didn't feel attached to this identity. And then decided that I had come out as trans. I had started hormone replacement therapy, started estrogen, spironolactone, and had in some ways killed off this drag persona and had adopted it into my everyday being. And so I describe this as identity as being part of as a form of praxis. If you're not familiar with the word praxis, it came from Aristotle and was later popularized by a pedagogical theorist named Paulo Freire in his acclaimed book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1972. And Freire describes praxis as this reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. In simpler terms, it's an educational process that is a blending of knowledge, theory, experiences, learning, research, reading, knowledge, theory, experiences, learning. It's a cyclical process that is often informing a practice that practice and then makes a poiesis or is turned into work or some action of some kind. Activists have a praxis. Anyone that has something that they're doing has a praxis, and identity is mine. The experiences of having gender troubles informs the work that I make. Those ideas aren't necessarily directly related to the work I make, but they might also be adjacent to the work I make. So the idea of gender is always there. And so I started reflecting, like I'd said before, freshman year, I had thought a lot about dying, or thought a lot about the death of an identity. And I started thinking about what is the birth of an identity. And so this is kind of where the idea of identity creation came from. It's this disbelief that I have that I find somewhat problematic, and that gender or sexual practices or sexual identities are ones we're born with that are constant in our lives. That who we are when we come out of the womb is set on a path, and we cannot stray from that path. And I just don't believe that to be true. I believe that can be detrimental to an identity. I believe that we are products of our own experiences. Our identities are informed by our surrounding world, that we can be born one thing and live to be another, and that our identities can be created. We can change our identities. We have this authority, we have this autonomy to make that choice. And so identity serves as an ever-changing position relative to the world around us. And so that's what kind of this idea of identity creation came from, that later I start writing about and then start proposing work about. So foremost, I think of myself as a writer before I think of myself as a sculptor. I have to write, I have to have my concepts, and before I make visual work. And so I had to really sit down and think about this idea of identity creation. I never really thought about the birth of the me sitting here talking to you virtually is the me that came out of the womb. The birth of the self here today, in some ways, it came from my mother's car accident when I was 9. So I have a lot of trouble remembering things about childhood. When I was in the 3rd grade, my mother was arrested for drug-related charges, and that was really traumatic for a 9-year-old. And so I completely do not remember the 3rd grade. I have a lot of problems remembering the 3rd grade. And so she died in this car accident the summer after my 3rd grade year when I was 9. And I had to grow up very quickly and take care of myself. My dad became an only father who had a full-time job. And so this car accident changed me and made the me today radically different than the me that would have been here today if had this never happened. I would have been making radically different work. I would not have had maybe I wouldn't have the identity that I have if that would have happened. So I sat down, I started writing in my notes, in my notes page, and also in my sketchbook. It's named Syntax. And so in Syntax, I was writing about this idea of identity creation that later informed the identity for a sculptural piece called Genesis, which I'll show you. And then later the foundations for this exhibition. So I'll go ahead and read what it is I wrote that day that I thought about my birth and my mother's car accident. So it's titled The Phenomenology of Identity Creation at the Instantaneous Convergence of Spatial Intersection. I will note that most of my work has a lot of words. I'm very attached to words, and sometimes I can't edit things very well. And so I keep the words. So they're a little bit wordy. Time is dependent of space, just as space is dependent of time. Without time, there exists no space. Its construction and deconstruction never occurring. Without space, there is no time happening. The confluence of these two has the potential to create radical change. Constructions and deconstructions of spaces takes place immediately, and time happens. This phenomenological experience of space-time convergence is directly related to my mother's car accident. The happening of time stopped for my mother when, at the exact time, time was created around me. I, who I happen to be now, is a result of the confluence of time and space. My mother's existence ceased to exist, and I was born into her vacancy, for this is my conception. The deconstruction of the self happening instantly as a new self emerges from its ashes. So this is a foundation to the idea of in and out spatial influences on identity creation. It's a combination of ideas thinking about spaces and architecture and temporality. And this exhibition has been serving to me as a collection of growing and changing ideas that I've had during my time at SCIC, and is equally serving as a point in which I turn to new directions in my practice. There are ideas within this exhibition I want to hold on to further, and there are also ideas I want to move away from. And seeing my work in one space has allowed me to see a through line, and there are things I want to keep and things I want to take. And I'll kind of talk about the trajectory of my work at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and now talk about each individual piece. There's 5 pieces within the exhibition. So this is Genesis, 8 still frames of 2 cars colliding with the hood of 2007 Nissan Maxima. Again, very wordy. I don't know. I do not think that this has changed. There we go. All right, going back. Okay. Genesis came from thinking about certain instantaneous points in our lived experience, which our identities change and take on new meanings. So the idea of my mother's car and the other car that caused her death, and the point at which these 2 cars meet, this is in some ways how I feel about the conception of my modern identity, while simultaneously being the death of an old me, that there exists a pre-car accident me and a post-car accident me. Alongside the light box stands this car hood that is the same make, model, year, and color of the car my mother had died in. And I present it with this light box as an artifact of my birth, something that is taken from the exact moment in which I feel I was born. So this is the light box. It's a steel casing with 8 still frames. The first 3 are, they are not touching. The 4th one, it's the exact point at which these 2 cars meet, and the rest of the frames is when these are colliding, where the metal and the tires and everything is meshing together, and that is the me that I see. The next piece in the gallery is a piece titled Una Festa Haas, Without a Permanent Home. I was thinking about family and the relationship to the self and the relationship of the self to the domestic space, specifically to the domestic space that is ever changing. I was thinking about the potentiality of the home as it not being a space that is set in geographic location, but that one can return to, that it's a mindset that travels with you, that the home doesn't necessarily have to be a house. It can be this thing that we return to mentally, that we can have roots in. The sign is latex. It's casted in latex. It's Ohne feste Haus backwards. And this phrase I adapted from the phrase Ohne feste Adresse, which was used by Nazi Germany in World War II when they would keep extensive records of people. So when someone was migrating, or someone that moved around a lot and they couldn't quite pinpoint where it is they're from or where they were born, they would write Ohne feste Adresse. And I changed the phrase to Haus because I was more concerned with locating myself back to a home, rather than back to this like kind of logistical description of a house. It was less about the house, more about the home. And the latex, the reason I chose latex is it's kind of a stand-in for the body. So it's this phrase of without a permanent home is moving with you. On the concrete plinth, it's a screen print of 8 homes. All of these homes I have lived in from the ages of 0 to 19. It's hard to see in the documentation. You can see it in the gallery, but there's numbers underneath each house. One before the dash and one after the dash. The one before signifies the house number, while the one after the dash signifies how many times I moved into that house. So moving a lot, I would sometimes be moved into a house multiple times, repeatedly. And so some of them I have moved in 3 times and some of them I've moved in only once. So this experience of moving a lot influenced the ways in which I felt at home. I had to leave it to myself to kind of feel at home instead of being at home, because the home could change. It was, there was availability for my home to be something different. So I had to come into my own terms mentally where I could feel at home in each of these houses. The next one is 4 o'clock somewhere. This is referencing a period of time, specifically in the summer of 2019, where I suffered from a very debilitating depression. It was the first summer I was in Chicago full time, because the summer before I had moved to Chicago and started SASC in 2018. So this is the first time I was like kind of on my own in the city. And I have a history of going off and on and back off of hormones. And during this summer, I had been off. I decided to go off of them. And if you're not familiar with how hormone replacement therapy works, especially estrogen, when you go on, it's essentially jumpstarting a puberty. When you go off, it's essentially jumpstarting a menopause. And so when this happened, my hormones were everywhere, and I isolated myself a lot of the time in the bedroom, where I didn't really care to make work. I wasn't looking at work. I wasn't thinking about work. I really truly cared about getting through this point of my life. And so this installation is a piece of a bedroom that is stripped down to its bare components that I think make up a bedroom. At the time, I was living with a partner who had gone back to their country for the summer, and that country was 8 hours ahead of us. So at 4 p.m., it would be midnight there. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to call them if I was feeling upset, or I was feeling, I was questioning a lot of things. And so all summer I would dread 4 o'clock, because I knew that the remainder of the evening I would be left with my own thoughts. I was separated from something that gave me at the time this stability, because my hormones were so unstable. Thus, I was unstable, my emotions were. And so I was contemplating the choices I had made to go off HRT. I was contemplating who I was and who I wanted to be. And after that summer, I went back to school, and this was the first thing I had made after that period of time, where I felt like that time, while it lasted 3 months, it felt like an eternity, because hormones have that effect on you. Next is, this is a video I had made in 2019. The video is a reflection on this gendered phenomenon of passing. When I had made this, I was, I would say 5 months into doing hormones, my first round. And so I really was reflecting what it meant to be trans. What did it mean to look trans, to be trans in a world where my gender presentation had to behave in a cisgendered framework? What did it mean to walk outside and be perceived as something that maybe I wasn't, and maybe something perceived as something I wanted to be? And so this is a reflect of that. So I'm going to play just a minute of it. It's like 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So the latter 1 minute and 30 seconds will be available to you in the gallery. So I'll go ahead and play it. Also, YouTube hates me and is making the pixelation really bad. Can you hear the sound? Okay, so then the other one you'll be able to see on the monitor in the gallery. Okay, so this is Self-Portrait in Conversation with Gordon Hall's Why I Don't Talk About the Body, a Polemic. Gordon Hall, I had mentioned previously, influences my practice significantly, and they graduated SAIC in 2011. There are 5 screen prints here. There's one that is 8 feet by 4 feet on MDF, and the other 4 are their essay that I printed on Stonehenge. So Hall talks about the body as being a term that is used in the art world, that they talk about the body as being a signifier for a body that is one of many. When we speak about the body, we're often referencing a body. It's very hard to talk about the body without referencing 7 billion of them. So we have designated, for some reason, the cisgendered, male, heterosexual, white, able-bodied, 5'9", 150, 200 pounds. And this is the body that we have decided is the standard. And they talk about this and how detrimental it is to think about it in that way. I know that I'm not cis. I know that I'm not male. I know that I'm not heterosexual. I know that I'm not able-bodied. I know that on a good day, I'm 5'9". And I know that my body is not the body that the art world is referencing, and neither is Hall's. They're a trans artist and make sculptural objects that involve performance work. And it's all work that is traditionally relating to the body, but they know that the body is so abstract and so different from one person to the next that relating their work or work in general to one body would be equally a disservice to artwork. And so they refuse to use the body in their practice when they're giving, press releases, interviews, statements. They don't use the body because, like, what is that truly? And so when I made this work, was kind of responding to this idea. I was in fetal position in negative space, and I was full of questions about what it meant to have a body, what my body looked like, how my body was perceived in public, how I personally perceived my body in private. In this work, I feel like I approach my work very writerly. I think that, no one wants to write something meaningless. No one wants to read something meaningless. Sometimes it's easier to look at something that's visual work that looks cool, and maybe you don't know the concept, but it's really hard to sit down and read something that you really have no idea what that is. And so I approach my work trying to answer questions myself. And this work was a lot less trying to answer a question and more asking myself questions. So where do I go with my work from here? I have realized that making work larger and heavier than myself is very hard on my body, and it's wearing me down. And so I want to start getting smaller. I want to start concentrating on ideas. I want to see how smallness can take up space. I was just in my tutorials for visual and critical studies class before this talk, and we really talked, we had little groups, and we were hyper focused on the fleetingness of queerness. What does it mean to be queer? How do you define queerness? We can see it, we can feel it, but how do you truly describe it? And so I think that I want to explore this potentiality and define queerness in my own terms through materials and words, and really see what it is that it can be. Thank you. So now time for a Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Birdie. So now we have some time for some Q&A. So please feel free to either come off mute and just, you don't have to turn on your camera if you don't want to ask your question, or you can also feel free to write it in the chat box, and then I can ask it aloud.
I have a question. First, I just wanted to thank you for sharing all of that. That was great. Thank you, Birdie. So I feel like there's a lot of iconography that can be witnessed in your work, a lot having to do with time and space, obviously. So what are your thoughts on environment affecting identity, and if there can be a variation in a single identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, in some ways, I think that there is a differentiality between where we grow up and who we are. I know that growing up where I'm from has significantly changed who I am, or has influenced, especially me as a queer human. And I think that our environments have this ability to shape us, that has this, they have factors that maybe we don't realize at first, but they definitely have an influence.
I'm going to ask a kind of a question that I have been thinking about is how, like you mentioned kind of at the beginning, like having all of your works in one space and kind of seeing them all together, maybe for the first time, all kind of like that.
Yeah.
How has that, I guess, impacted how you see the works, or do you feel like there's any maybe like conversation that the works or way the works are interacting that you didn't foresee when you first, started installation or started thinking about this exhibition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't at first when I was making the work, I didn't realize that the work really, I could see that it came from the same hand. I was worried that I was like, oh, maybe this work is gonna be all very radically different and look very radically different. It's gonna be weird to have it in the same space. And when it came into the same space, I was like, wow, this, I can tell it's me. And there's a part of me as well that's seen it in one space in some ways feels like closure. Like it feels like I'm ready to see what else I can make. Cause I think that I have in my own head have had like a Rolodex of things, of ideas and of aesthetics that I'm ready to kind of like take out all those cards and change it. And kind of thinking about what would my work look like with new work, with old work. I mean, this is a lot of the work in there is from 2019 to 2021, but there really was no work being made in 2020 because of COVID. So it's really like 2 years of things. And so it's very easy to kind of get in the habit of the same aesthetics and the same concepts over and over again. And so I think that seeing it all in one space, I'm ready for the potentiality of new work, and new modes of thinking.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can ask a question too.
Mhm.
Really quickly, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing. It was really beautiful, and I'm really happy to be here to be able to see it. I'm in Boston, so I can't be there in person to see the exhibit, so this was great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the transition between theory and creation. I'm thinking of like Bell Hook's theory as liberatory practice and how you go about the process of taking like text and literature and putting it into your artwork.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's one thing that I wish to do a little bit more, and is to take theory and writing more directly. I think that I have read, throughout my time at SAC, a lot of queer theory, and that I think that it's a little bit internalized, that I have these ideas that, I'm not necessarily drawing from something specific. I'm not like going to Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology and pulling directly from that, and actually basing work off of that. But that is something I'm interested in doing now, and is kind of incorporating text and writing more directly. I kind of feel like theory for myself has kind of come through me and has influenced the way I see the world, and therefore the ways in which I experience the world, that work then is influenced by that. And so there's definitely an installation of things happening. And so I'm now interested in seeing what would things look like if I pulled from text directly. We could do one more if someone has a really interesting question.
I don't know that this is a very interesting question. Oh, here's somebody has written in. Would you consider a connection between gender performance and objects of ephemera, or how do you see a connection between such an approach?
I do consider there being a connection. I mean, honestly, the idea of the object in performance, I like can't unthink about Jordan Hall, which I have just talked about them so much. But the way in which they kind of project their gender with performance objects is what they call them. And I think that that connection between the sculptural object and the gender performance, I mean, I'm very hyper focused on labor and work as well. That's always been an interest of mine. And so there's something about the making of an object and how laborious it can be as a gendered performance. And that has also been on my mind. And so I think that there definitely is this connection between the object and the gender performance. I don't think we can stray from that. Yeah, I hope that answered the question broadly, but yeah, I think that's a really good question. It has me thinking about a few things.
The next question in the chat asks, what is inspiring you for 2022?
Smallness. Smallness for sure.
I'm wondering, with smallness, are you also, because so much of your works seem so heavy. Are you also considering weight when you think about smallness?
Yeah. That's kind of the light box I made. And it's by no means a light object, but it's much lighter comparative to the other things. Like I can carry it with both arms. And there is this idea of being able to use my body to transport my objects that when I made that, it was like the first time I've ever made something like that. And I was just, I don't know, I was so dumbfounded. I was kind of like, why have I never done this before? And so I think that the idea of smallness and even like heavy smallness and light smallness, to me, I don't know, there's a lot of potential for that, especially in queerness. I feel like there's this, when things are small, sometimes they can be missed. And so I feel like in some ways that's kind of like a metaphor for queerness also. And so there's a tie that I feel like I really want to explore with that.
Another question that someone just wrote in privately asks about kind of your connection with German language in like German phrases in addition to, it seems like maybe English, and just asking, are there any other languages or aspects of language that influence you?
Yeah. So my paternal side of my family is from Germany. My dad's mom was born in Germany. And so there is that connection. Hence why I think that I chose Ohne feste Haus for the phrase versus something else. That I was talking about family and moving. And so I felt right using German. I don't speak German fluently. But there are other things about language that, especially with poetics, that I feel very inspired by. A lot of my work, I've like used parentheticals. Like I said, I use a lot of words. I don't know, there's like length of words, there's the amount of words, there's words in parentheticals, words outside of the parentheticals that I'm inspired by. So it's a little less about the speaking of language and more of the writing of language.
I think we have time for a few more questions if there's anyone out there who hasn't had a chance or has something they're dying to know.
And if you don't, that's okay.
That's okay. Great. Well, Birdie, thank you so much. This
Thank
was
you.
such an incredible talk. It's so wonderful to hear about all of your work. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been recorded, and so we'll have this up on the website, on site's website in a few weeks. If you're part of the SAIC community, please come stop by in the gallery. It is up until February 23rd, Wednesday, February 23rd. If you're outside of the SAIC community, you can also visit our website, visit site's website, and send us an email, and we can schedule a time to have you come visit. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.